The other Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau, he just wanted to steal our wealth. He didn't want to extinguish it.
Right from the entrance into Canada, there was this dynamic of Ottawa versus the West.
From the West, it looks like they're stealing our oil again. But from the East, it looks like the wise, civilized people are keeping the barbarians under control.
The logic of it is killing the goose that lays the golden egg. But that's done on purpose.
Welcome to Alberta, the epicenter of the growing political and economic influence of Western Canada, and also increasingly much frustration, angst, and Western alienation. From the imposition of carbon taxes to the tens of billions of dollars plundered through equalization, this is a province and region fed up with a federal government and prime minister that they view as antagonistic, exploitive, and directly undermining their legitimate aspirations. So what does this mean for Canada and its future? Do more powers need to be devolved to the provincial level? Do the West's contributions need to be better recognized by the country as a whole? Or is the dream that was Confederation already so far gone that it's best if we all just go our separate ways?
The problem you have in Canada, I think, is a structural one.
Most provinces pay, and Quebec, as one entity, receives. There's just nothing equitable about that.
It's kind of a welfare of the Confederation. That's how I see it. I don't see anything being proud of that.
My name is Aaron Gunn, and this is Politics Explained.
Separatist talks getting louder in Alberta.
At the same time, several politicians are vying to be our next premier by promoting a more independent Alberta.
Separatist signs now replacing election signs as the movement to leave the rest of Canada picking up steam.
Look no further than this upside-down Canadian flag, where hundreds gathered to discuss separation.
We're going to make Alberta great again, and that is when we cut ourselves off from the leech that is Eastern Canada.
Throughout its 156 years of nationhood, Canada has endured many great divides. English versus French, Catholic versus Protestant, upper versus lower. But while the national media has preferred to focus its attention on the separatist schism in Quebec, another growing divide that has been decades in the making is threatening to again push Canadian unity to its absolute limit. This is the divide between the East and the West. In the West, British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, while in the East, Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes, and Newfoundland. Since their entrance into Canada, Western provinces have found their wealth in resources, whereas Eastern Canada, primarily Quebec and Ontario, rely more on secondary industries, manufacturing, big business, and bureaucracy. This contrast in itself is not inherently bad, but a series of decisions by Ottawa, specifically targeting resource industries, has angered Western provinces and, increasingly, the people who live there. Projects shut down, taxes imposed, job killing made in Ottawa regulations that have reduced investment, collapsed production, and put the very existence of Western Canada's most important industries into doubt. These perceived attacks have led an increasing number of Western Canadians to question whether being a part of Canada is worth it at all. According to a poll conducted in 2022 by Research Co., a third of Albertans now say that Alberta would be better off as a separate country, a higher percentage than even Quebec. So what exactly is causing this, and how long has the problem been going on? To find out, I flew to our nation's capital to meet John Robson, a journalist and historian well-versed in the origins of Western alienation. What do you think are kind of the origin story of Western alienation in Canada?
I think there's always been some element of feeling looked down on by the East. But, in the days of Sir John A. Macdonald, or even into the 20th century, the West kind of was the poor cousin. I think the core of the problem is that when the West grew up, it wasn't treated as an adult or a partner by Eastern Canada. They continue to be exploited in terms of resources, and I think that their viewpoints tended to be regarded not just that didn't just disagree with Western views, it regarded them with contempt. The line actually is, and it's an old one, is that it's 3,000 miles from Vancouver to Ottawa, but 30,000 miles from Ottawa to Vancouver. And I think the National Energy Program was an enormous example of how the East would treat the West not merely as something to be ripped off, but also something to be despised.
The National Energy Program was a policy brought in by Pierre Elliott Trudeau in 1980, following an election where the Liberals didn't win a single seat in BC, Alberta, or Saskatchewan. The purpose of the NEP was to give Ottawa control over Western Canada's energy industry and to force the West to sell its resources to the East at below market rates. Due to the NEP, unemployment in Alberta increased from 3.7% to 12.4%. The bankruptcy rate increased by 150%, and numerous families were left destitute and facing financial ruin, including famous Saskatchewan-born entrepreneur Brett Wilson.
Do you remember the National Energy Program? Do you remember, were those the kind of the seeds that were sown for what we see today? Or
79, 80, 81, I was up in Edmonton, came to Calgary, bought a house. We had $120,000 into it. We sold it for $72,000 or $73,000. I was effectively bankrupt, thanks to the NEP. But many people walked away from their homes. City blocks became the purview of some of the banks. I mean, it was just, it was horrible what was happening here. And there's never been a thoughtful apology or reconsideration.
Far from receiving an apology, while unemployment was reaching near depression levels in Western Canada, Trudeau decided to take a vacation on a luxury rail car through the Rocky Mountains. When he arrived in Salmon Arm, BC, he was met by a few angry Westerners, holding signs reading "Restraint" and "Practice what you preach." Instead of talking with the protesters, Pierre Trudeau looked out his train car window and gave the protesters the middle finger. The famous incident, now known as the Trudeau Salute, sent a clear message to the West. The National Energy Program was here to stay, and Ottawa simply didn't care about how it affected Western industries.
It's easy to say, well, this was an example of Pierre Trudeau having a very shallow view of economics, but the critical thing was that he was going to keep the price of Western oil low in order to subsidize Eastern Canada. So Western producers were getting ripped off so that Eastern consumers could benefit. And again, the fact that the West was outraged. This was politically a huge matter, and the East didn't care. And this, to me, it's not so much the initial mistake, though it was bad economics and bad for national unity, bad in every way. But when the West objected and made it clear this to us really matters, the East said, well, you don't really matter to us, so too bad.
This mounting frustration in Western Canada wasn't only directed at Trudeau. In fact, 6 years later, under Progressive Conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, another scandal, this time over Canada's F-18s, would strain the East-West divide all over again.
The CF-18 contract in 1986 was a pivotal moment because what happened is that it was actually a Winnipeg company that won on its merits the competition to do the maintenance on the CF-18s, but Brian Mulroney, who of course is from Quebec, instead awards it to, guess who, Bombardier.
The resources were all in Winnipeg. The skills were all in Winnipeg, and yet the contract was moved to Montreal. In the end, the skills and resources had to move to Montreal to follow the damn contract. It was so deep, profoundly wrong, such a bad decision, and such a stick in the eye for the West. That did it for me.
And this tells Westerners, normally the Liberals govern the country, and they despise you. But when your Conservative friends get in, they despise you too. That everybody in the East despises you. This was an enormously damaging moment for national unity. Just the whole sense that the deck is rigged in this country, and especially it's rigged against the West.
The building anger in the West, generated by the actions of both Liberal and Conservative governments, galvanized Westerners, building the foundation of a new political movement that would soon take the country by storm.
Right now, the politicians are on the inside and the rest of Canadians are locked out. Only Reform has a plan to change the system. Reform. Now you have a choice.
The CF-18 contract clearly was pivotal in having that first assembly with what the West wants in. But all of it, you have to realize, happens against a backdrop of a general feeling that they despise us and they don't listen to us, that there is fertile ground on which these seeds fall. And so when these things come along and galvanize the local political elites, there's a lot of support in the populace because they know in their hearts that the Laurentian elite thinks they're a bunch of hicks.
Founded in 1987, the Reform Party of Canada started out as a Western protest movement, but quickly evolved into the largest federal conservative party in the country. This new party, born out of Western frustration, included a young MP named Stephen Harper, who would go on to co-author the infamous firewall letter to Alberta Premier Ralph Klein that detailed how he believed the province could operate more autonomously within Confederation. Among the letter's 5 other signatories was Andy Crooks.
We didn't call it the firewall letter. The media called it the firewall. We don't want to create a barrier to the rest of Canada. That's not the point. It's as if you have a computer and you have a firewall to keep out the bad stuff. They were looking for a conservative response to the perceived leaning against and oppression of the West.
5 years after penning the firewall letter, Stephen Harper would lead a reunited Conservative Party to their first electoral victory in 18 years.
Let me just say one thing and let me be clear. The West has wanted in. The West is in now. Canada will work for all of us.
But in 2015, Harper was defeated, and a new prime minister with an all too familiar last name has seen the familiar themes of Western alienation and economic grievance resurrected all over again.
When Trudeau came out, my comment to people in the West was, listen to him. Let's listen to him. What he's saying at this time, 2015, could be in the interest of Canada. So give him a chance. I gave him a chance. That might have been a mistake with the benefit of hindsight. But again, it evolved, and his respect for the West is lost. He just makes no efforts whatsoever. He has no concern. At one time, he slipped and said, we want to shut down the oil sands.
We can't shut down the oil sands tomorrow. We need to phase them out.
What he's doing when he wants to shut down the oil sands is simply anti-Alberta, that he inherited 100% from his old man.
Regardez, le Canada fait dur maintenant parce que c'est des Albertains qui contrôlent notre agenda communautaire et socio-démocratique. Ça marche pas.
Est-ce que le Canada est mieux servi quand il y a plus de Québécois au pouvoir que quand il y a plus d'Albertains au pouvoir?
Ben, je suis libéral, alors c'est sûr que je pense que oui. T'sais, on a un rôle, ce pays, le Canada, est à nous.
He doesn't show up in the West very often, and when he does, it's to announce another just transition, if you will.
A federal memo about the just transition is a fresh source of tension on this already difficult issue. Leaders in Alberta point to the document as evidence of the policy's destructive intent.
Euphemistically called the just transition, the federal government has launched a campaign to transition Western Canada's economy away from oil and gas and towards so-called green jobs, leaving many in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and northeastern BC to wonder what they'll do for work if the oil and gas industry is shut down by Trudeau. I sat down with world-renowned economist Dr. Jack Mintz to find out what the impact of this so-called just transition will be and how it might amplify feelings of frustration within Western Canada.
When the federal government starts picking on certain sectors to bear the brunt of a policy rather than a more neutral approach, given that we have concentrations of certain sectors in the economy in certain places, then obviously that's going to have an impact. But the problem that I have also had with this whole concept is that people keep on talking about one job is just the same as another job, but it's not. In the oil and gas sector, in non-conventional oil and gas, basically the oil sands, the amount produced by that sector is $985 per working hour. And the salaries that people get, over $100 per working hour. That's a lot. It's the highest paid sector in the economy. if you fire all the people from oil and gas and you're going to start offering them jobs in the so-called green economy, well, the green economy is offering something like $40 per hour in salaries. So we're not talking about the same type of job.
Just transition is about taking the jobs that we have in the energy industry and transitioning them. And they've even made comments that there'll be lots of jobs for janitors and drivers.
So to me, if you're going to be talking about just transition, it's not just creating jobs, it's equally paying jobs, which I don't think is going to happen.
To put into perspective just how impactful this just transition could be, consider that Canada's oil and gas industry currently contributes more than $108 billion to Canada's economy every single year and employs more than 500,000 Canadians, primarily in Western Canada. Unfortunately, it seems this so-called just transition has already begun.
The government proposes that the price on carbon pollution should start at a minimum of $10 per ton in 2018, rising by $10 each year to $50 per ton in 2022.
In 2018, Justin Trudeau imposed a federal carbon tax on the country. Its point was to make it even more expensive for Canadians and businesses to produce and consume fossil fuels, hammering energy-intensive industries like agriculture, forestry, and especially oil and natural gas. Many in the West saw the carbon tax as a direct assault on their most important industries. Even worse, the tax didn't apply equally to all provinces, leading some to think this was just another case of an Ottawa double standard.
The federal carbon tax is essentially an attempt to create a national standard for the provinces to enact their own carbon taxes or something that meets what Ottawa considers an acceptable carbon tax. So what you have is a federal tax now that applies in some provinces and doesn't apply in others. For some reason, Quebec was given a pass on this. I'll let people speculate about that. Their system is not a carbon tax. Their system is a different kind of mixed system.
This seemingly arbitrary imposition of a new federal tax on some but not all provinces angered those that did not want a carbon tax imposed but were forced to adopt one anyway, especially provinces where the ability to profitably extract natural resources was now jeopardized by the sudden existence of the tax. But was this federal carbon tax mandate even legal to begin with?
The federal carbon tax faces another legal test in an Alberta court today. The province will make its case that the tax is unconstitutional.
When we heard that some of the provinces were looking to start challenging this in court for jurisdiction reasons, we intervened in the Alberta case, the Saskatchewan case, the Ontario case, and then again at the Supreme Court.
The right to extract and exploit natural resources is clearly a provincial right under the Constitution.
And was this something to do with the 82 constitutional negotiations and Rennie Levesque working with the Premier of Alberta at the time? I don't know if it was Logie. Is that what this is all about?
That's exactly. 92A came out of that negotiation you're talking about. So, the most recent legislative amendment to the Constitution, and arguably the clearest expression of the words of the Constitution going back to 1867, show that natural resources is a provincial jurisdiction. It's always been treated that way throughout Canadian history.
On March 25th, 2021, the Supreme Court of Canada, the highest court in the country, made a verdict on the case.
This was really a jump ball when it got to the Supreme Court. We lost. Obviously, we disagree with their interpretation of the decision.
The Supreme Court of Canada, unique among courts, is allowed to decide that the times have just changed, and what the words of a law meant, or the words of the Constitution meant 20 years ago, they mean something else now. This at least sows the seeds for the end of Confederation, because it's treating the provinces basically like municipalities rather than as their own sovereign governments. They've created an ability for the federal cabinet to dictate policy to the provincial governments. In an area that everyone admits is fundamentally provincial jurisdiction,
Despite a province's right over the development of its resources being enshrined in Section 92A of the Canadian Constitution, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the federal government, leaving Western industries that rely on hydrocarbons to pay up and shut up. And far from dialing back or moderating his approach since the decision, Trudeau has only continued to double down.
What is Bill C-69? Why don't we start there?
Bill C-69 is a carbon tax on steroids. So the federal government has now been granted jurisdiction to regulate in an area of provincial responsibility in respect of carbon. And Bill 69 broadens that to not only include emissions of carbon, but also to regulate projects which may create future emissions of carbon, whether a province builds a hospital or a pulp mill or a mine, wholly within that province. It's
wholly within the province.
Wholly within the province. It's now, according to this legislation, subject to a full federal environmental review. Any project that produces carbon emissions of any sort.
Is this active law right now?
Yes, it is.
C-69 has been dubbed the No More Pipelines bill, and that's because they believe that ultimately the conditions will never be met. It will continually be a higher and higher bar to try to get pipelines put into the country. And with Alberta being a landlocked province, we need pipelines to be able to export our oil and gas to the rest of the world.
I mean, this is the evisceration of separate provincial powers. It basically means that provinces can do policing and run a healthcare system, but they don't actually have any sovereignty anymore over the development of their province. So it was declared unconstitutional and illegal by the highest court in Alberta.
After being deemed unconstitutional by Alberta's judiciary, the fate of Bill C-69 will be determined by the Supreme Court. But judging by how the Supreme Court ruled on the carbon tax, Western provinces certainly aren't holding their breath. But why does the Supreme Court continue siding against Western Canada? Well, it could have something to do with the court's composition. According to the Canadian Constitution, Canada is to have 9 Supreme Court judges. By convention, this includes 1 for the Atlantic provinces, 2 for the Western provinces, and 3 for the province of Ontario. Meanwhile, the province of Quebec, with just over 8 million people, is constitutionally guaranteed 3 judges of their own.
Essentially, that means that 6 of the 9 judges are lawyers who practiced in Montreal or Toronto or Ottawa.
3 of the Supreme Court justices have to come from Quebec. Why? Well, because that's the way the Constitution's set up. A third of the Supreme Court of Canada is already prejudiced in terms of Laurentian interests. Their decisions have shown this time and time again.
But it's not just the makeup of the Supreme Court that disadvantages Westerners. In many ways, our Constitution is designed to keep Western Canada on the outside looking in.
Representation in Parliament. Quebec, with its claim to a sacrosanct percentage of the House of Parliament.
You know, it's also the makeup of the Senate. Like that's one where they get a minimum number of seats. Does not matter whether or not they have the population to meet it or not. Even if Alberta had the same population size as Quebec, we're still never going to have the same number of Senate seats as Quebec has.
At some point, that's not going to work. At some point, that's going to break the Federation when your chief law body is broken down on regional grounds and gives a permanent monopoly of power to the Laurentian elite, essentially.
So almost every major political institution in the country serves the interests of the Laurentians, not the rest of us.
Over the years, like some of the biggest examples of corporate welfare have been to Pratt & Whitney and Bombardier in Quebec. I mean, they've propped up the aerospace industry in Quebec to the detriment of a lot of other companies in this country. That adds the fuel to the fire to people out west who look at it and say, you know, why are they taking my money and doing that?
It's against a backdrop of knowing that Western votes don't matter, that elections are decided in the East, and the parties that get elected don't have a high regard for the West.
Certainly, you know, when we talk about money being spent, seeing the flow of money from the West, Alberta, Saskatchewan, equalization is obviously the big one. That's the one that gets most of the headlines. That's one that people have been very, very upset about for years.
When it comes to Canada's constitution, maybe nothing angers the West more than equalization payments. But what are they? How do they work? And why are they really needed? To find out, I traveled to Nova Scotia, one of Canada's easternmost provinces, and a recipient of equalization payments. I met with Alex Wayland, an economist at the Fraser Institute, to ask him about equalization and how it affects the province he calls home.
Explain what the equalization program is to the everyday Canadian.
Sure. So at its most basic form, the equalization program is a payment from the Government of Canada to recipient provinces on an annual basis for the purpose of equalizing those provinces' ability to deliver services to their residents. That's the intent of the program.
They look at the formula, they add up all of your potential revenues, they look at what you're spending, and then they say, okay, well, this province over here doesn't have as much opportunity to raise revenues as this one, so let's give them more of the chunk of the pie.
It's a very large transfer program from the federal government to recipient provinces. This year, the total amount of equalization funding being dispersed will be about $24 billion. Around 2/3 of that goes to Quebec.
Quebec gets the biggest chunk of it. They're getting over 50% of the revenue, but the Atlantic provinces get it, Manitoba gets it, occasionally Ontario and Saskatchewan get it, but it's been a long time, I think, since BC and Alberta have ever got any money out of the equalization program.
Roughly speaking, Prince Edward Island receives about $2,700 per person per year. And then,
is that like man, woman, and child, just to clarify?
Yes, yes, per capita.
The babies are getting that much too.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
And do you have a sense of just how much this equalization and equalization transfer payments are costing, for example, the average Albertan?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at just the average Albertan this year, it's just under $700 per person that is being transferred from the pockets of Albertans into the pockets of people in have-not provinces.
This staggering amount of money flowing west to east creates a tremendous amount of resentment among many Western Canadians. But in principle, equalization is meant to create fairness, to give every Canadian a piece of Canada's natural wealth. But is it simply that the West has natural resources and the East does not? Or perhaps, does it all have to do with actions of specific provincial governments?
We had a project, $4 billion investment in a small region, the Saguenay, northeast of Quebec. The population out there was over 70% supportive of the project, so there was social acceptability. The government campaigned in favor of the project, and when they got elected, they flip-flopped.
This would have been the largest private investment in the entire province's history. But when the government had a choice whether or not to do it, they axed the project.
So what is Quebec's rejection of the Saguenay LNG export facility really about? Is it simply because the project was meant to export Western gas to markets around the world? Just outside Montreal, I met with Eric Tétrault, the president of the Quebec Energy Association, to find out.
You hear a lot in Canada about our vast oil and gas deposits, hydrocarbons, Western Canada, even Newfoundland. But how about here in Quebec? Is there any hydrocarbon resources that this province has?
We have natural gas, and we have lots of it. There's a lot of natural gas under that field.
Right under our feet here, there's natural gas.
Absolutely. That gas is just lying underneath, unexploited. Between $50 and $200 billion commercial worth of natural gas under our soil. We just don't want to exploit it because we are different.
Quebec is sitting on as much as $186 billion in natural gas, and that resource is not being developed at a time when that province receives substantial equalization payments from provinces or from the federal government via provinces that develop their natural resources.
They would actually do a net zero, no carbon emission extraction of the natural gas there, and the government's still saying no. It's truly, when they say no to that, it's not about the environment.
But why would Quebec not develop their own abundant natural gas, especially when it can be developed while producing no new net emissions and significantly reduce the province's dependence on equalization?
Natural resource revenues are a very important part of the equalization formula because we see that recipient provinces tend to have disincentives to develop their natural resources.
if the provinces ended up trying to expand the resource sector, they could actually not only lose resource revenues, but also equalization payments. And in fact, it was calculated for Nova Scotia and Newfoundland particularly, that for every dollar of additional resource revenues that they receive, the province would lose 95 cents on every dollar that they would get because of equalization, basically clawing back any of the gains.
If recipient provinces like Quebec develop their natural resources, their equalization payments would be significantly reduced. Not to mention, they may actually be forced to pay into equalization instead, creating a massive disincentive for provinces to develop their resources and grow their economies.
And if you look at, for example, a province like New Brunswick, we actually modeled that if they develop 10% of their natural resources, in other words, a 10% boost in revenue, would be clawed back at a 97% rate.
Are there any examples of resource development projects in recipient provinces that may have not been pursued because of this disincentive?
If you look at a province like Nova Scotia, onshore natural gas exploration is banned. New Brunswick, for example, academic research has shown that over about the past decade, that province has given up $40 billion in natural resource development.
$40 billion?
$40 billion. Okay. This very province receives a significant amount of equalization, which is principally funded by some provinces that have been more aggressive in developing their natural resources.
Decisions by New Brunswick, Quebec, and other resource-rich provinces to not develop their natural resources while receiving equalization payments from provinces that do reeks of hypocrisy. But not everyone in these so-called have-not provinces are happy with the status quo. New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs has aggressively pursued resource extraction pipelines and fought vehemently against both the carbon tax mandate and Bill C-69, and has choice words for those who gladly accept Western transfer payments in one hand while failing to develop their own natural resources here at home.
We're going to go chat now with the Premier of New Brunswick, Mr. Blaine Higgs, who's been really an outlier in his outspokenness against equalization, which is the redistributive program that he's a recipient of as Premier. So we're going to go chat with Mr. Higgs and see what he has to say.
Do you feel like you understand the frustration and even alienation that many of those in Western Canada, especially Alberta and Saskatchewan, feel for what they perceive to be a tax against its most important industry?
I absolutely do. And I also feel that if you have the ability to raise your bar on being more self-sufficient, and you're not willing to do that, but yet you're willing to take that same support from another province that is doing it, and I refer to oil and gas. But it should be there for people that are not able to develop, not so much for those that just refuse not to do so.
But no, it's $14 billion that Quebec gets, and this is money we're getting because we don't have the same level of wealth as other provinces. But the reason why we don't have that same level of wealth is unfortunately because our government keeps putting hurdles. And why does it keep putting hurdles? Is because when it takes an economically sound decision, such as developing resources, but one that's a little bit more controversial with some people, it has to pay the full political cost, but it doesn't get the full benefit. So it is disincentivizing development at the expense of course, those that pay into equalization, like Alberta and Saskatchewan, but also at the expense of Quebec workers that could get better paying jobs, that could get better standards of living, but that government is instead favoring its own revenue instead of the people's revenue.
Unfortunately for Quebecers, their government has since gone one step further, fully banning the development of all oil and gas projects in their province via what's known as a moratorium. And they didn't even stop there, moving on to vigorously campaign against pipelines that simply would have transited Western oil through Quebec from one province to another.
There is no social acceptability for a pipeline that would pass through Quebec territory, he says. I am not embarrassed to refuse dirty energy while we are offering clean energy at a competitive price.
On October 5th, 2017, Energy East, a pipeline that would have taken Western oil across the country to be refined, consumed, and exported from Eastern Canada, was cancelled, due in large part to the hurdles put in place by Quebec. Predictably, this infuriated many of the Western provinces, but they weren't the only ones affected by this decision.
They ended up being partway along, investing heavily in design and construction and all of the plans, and then Quebec said, not in my backyard, and for Quebec to be allowed to just shut us off here from the east for an energy project that meant so much to the East Coast. It shouldn't be in a national program. It should not be allowed.
Frankly, I don't think it's acceptable that we say no to pipelines coming from Western Canada, but we still collect the money from it. Boats, it's everywhere in the world, right? Trains, it's everywhere in the world. But what are pipelines associated to? They're associated to Alberta, they are associated to Western Canada, they are associated with English Canada, and certainly Quebecers don't want that, right? They want your money, they don't want your pipelines. And if Quebec should know one thing, is that we had that train accident in Lac-Mégantic. 48 people died. It was not an oil accident. It was a train accident, right? Which carried oil. And pipelines are a lot safer.
But I mean, it's ridiculous, right? Quebecers use fossil fuels. They've got, the Premier said there's no social license for pipelines. And Quebec has, tens of thousands of kilometers of pipelines that distribute hydrocarbon energy all around. But it's like, oh, it's the West. Yuck, Western oil. That stuff stinks. They don't mind importing it, but not from the West. So it tells you that, Quebecers like foreign countries. They prefer Russia to the West. Well, that hurts. And it's so gratuitously rude. You'd think, again, Canadians are so famously polite, you'd think someone could be polite to the West. Say, hey, you guys are great. You're dynamic, you're energetic, you're a marvelous part of our country. We're sorry about the past. We're going to do better. But you never get that. You always get, why don't you shut up, greasy, greedy know-nothings.
As if this wasn't all egregious enough, even within the equalization formula itself, Quebec somehow manages to get special treatment again.
The fact that Quebec is virtually the lone recipient of equalization payments, and yet they proudly point out that they've got the lowest cost of electricity domestically.
So Quebec's approach to electricity pricing leads to major issues with the calculation of equalization payments on a yearly basis.
So I mean, they are making money that's not considered in any way, shape, or form in part of equalization.
We've done calculations that show that if Quebec were to charge market rates for electricity, their equalization payments in a given year would be halved or less.
And to consider Quebec a have-not province is ridiculous. In terms of what resources get fed into the mix. Hydroelectricity is not one of them. Oil and gas is a major one.
So it's not very hard to draw the conclusion that the federal government treats Quebec differently. And we all know that there's lots of political reasons for that, but it certainly doesn't make good law.
But perhaps it's not just Western provinces who are hurt by the special treatment Quebec gets from the federal government. In fact, those who are impacted the most may just be everyday Quebecers themselves.
You speak to a little bit about some of the negative consequences of this program for those who are actually recipients of it.
Oh yeah, I mean it's the old welfare trap, right? You talk about the people who get on welfare and they'd like to go get a job, but if they get a job and they start earning a little bit of money, then they get clawed back all their welfare money, and that's exactly the problem. Is that we've created provinces that do not want to develop their economy. They do not want to create these jobs because they would lose out on equalization.
Equalization is obviously bad for people like Albertans and Saskatchewanians that have to pay into it, but it's also bad for provinces like Quebec to receive it. it is good for the government that gets it, but it's bad for the people living in the provinces that get it. Because when Quebec or New Brunswick or other provinces say no to some resource development opportunities, sure, the government gets to keep its equalization revenue, but what doesn't happen is all the jobs that could get created, they don't get created. The new economic activity, the fact that we could have people with higher incomes, higher standards of living, that does not happen.
The only beneficiaries of equalization are the bureaucrats that administer it.
And I don't want to be a province that sits around and waits for a handout. I would rather become a province that is making its own way.
We have the potential to be much wealthier in Quebec. And unfortunately, because our governments are blinded by a lobby, we're not having our full potential right now. In the long run, Quebec is not winning. That's what we have to understand. We think that because we're getting a big check every year from the welfare transfer payment program, but in the long run, what it does kill our dynamic industries. And that's what's much more concerning for me in the long run.
As concerned as Quebecers are about their place in Canada, the alienation, exploitation, and sheer disrespect felt by many in the West is beginning to boil over, embodied in many ways by the election of a new premier in Alberta ready to take on the federal government.
Now, we have been made aware that in the coming weeks, Justin Trudeau is planning on bringing forward new restrictions on electricity generation from natural gas that will not only massively increase your power bills, but will also endanger the integrity and reliability of our entire power grid. And as Premier, I cannot, under any circumstances, allow these contemplated federal policies to be inflicted upon Albertans. I simply can't, and I won't. This is not a road we can afford to go down. If he persists, he will be hurting Canadians from coast to coast, and he will strain the patience and goodwill of Albertans in an unprecedented fashion.
Newly elected Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, has introduced legislation in the spirit of Stephen Harper's original firewall letter. Smith's law will put in place protections to shield Alberta from federal policies that violate provincial jurisdiction and infringe on Alberta's constitutional rights, while looking to expand Alberta's power and autonomy by potentially taking actions in the footsteps of those already taken by the province of Quebec, something that Justin Trudeau isn't too happy about.
Obviously, we're going to look at this very, very closely and think about the implications, but our focus remains on making sure that Albertans are part of a growing, cleaner economy and protect our environment for years to come.
The Sovereignty Act was meant to send a message to Albertans that we're going to defend ourselves.
Danielle's legislation, the UCP legislation, is taking together all of the rights that Quebec already has. And Quebec uses them as a shield, and Danielle has tried to hammer those same materials into a sword.
Certainly, it was a signal to the rest of the country that Albertans are still not happy with the equalization program, and things need to change.
Inspired by Alberta's Sovereignty Act, Saskatchewan has now passed sovereignty legislation of their own, something that could maybe be the start of a trend of provinces finally standing up to the federal government. But what remains to be seen is if the Supreme Court will continue to honor the original ethos and division of powers laid out by the Constitution, and if Alberta and Quebec will be able to set aside their differences and join together, as they did in 1982, to push back against the creeping centralization and increases in federal power favored by Trudeau.
All those, both Alberta and Saskatchewan are telling Ottawa to mind its own business and let Alberta do Alberta, Saskatchewan do Saskatchewan, much like Quebec for years has been telling Ottawa to mind its own business and let Quebec be Quebec. Mm-hmm. I think this country has always worked best when provinces understand and fight together against Ottawa's tendency to centralize.
Well, there is a positive story to Canada, and I think it's important not to forget this. Like our contribution to the 2 world wars, to opening the West, to creating prosperity, to becoming one of the breadbaskets of the world. All the great things that happen when Canadians don't get at odds with one another. And Canada deserves better than it's received, and so we all have to give it a try. If it fails, let it not be because we didn't make an effort.
We should find ways to have our country get stronger, not get weaker. And recognition of us all doing our part.
But again, it comes down to respect. For me, it's that simple.
We are a confederation of strong provinces. That's when we work best. And they need to have that balance restored.